The Murder at Willow Creek. A Miss Marple. Mystery. The stopper was wrong. That was the first thing. Before the body, before the constable's voice going thin in the doorway, before Mrs. Pringle's rigid hands folded white against her apron. The stopper of the sherry decanter sat slightly askew, tilted perhaps 3 degrees to the left of where it ought to have rested. A small thing, the kind of thing a person sets down in haste, or in the dark, or with trembling fingers and a mind on something else entirely. Miss Jane Marple noticed it the moment she crossed the threshold of Colonel Ashford's study. She noticed very little else for a full 4 seconds. The room itself was what one expected from a man of the Colonel's type. Books arranged by height rather than subject, a writing desk large enough to suggest authority, but 2 leather chairs the colour of old mustard. A gun cabinet along the far wall, locked. Curtains the shade of pewter, half drawn against the October morning. A smell of wood smoke and boot polish, and, beneath both, something sharper. Chemical, the kind of thing that caught at the back of the throat and suggested a laboratory, or a garden shed, or a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Colonel Ashford sat slumped across his desk as though sleep had taken him mid-sentence. One hand curled near the stem of his sherry glass. The other had dragged a sheet of paper partway off the desk, a letter half written, the pen still resting nearby where it had rolled from his fingers. His white moustache was very neat. Even in death, he had kept it neat. "Suicide," Constable Tibbs said, from somewhere behind Miss Marple's left shoulder. But he said it the way men said things when they had already decided, and were only waiting for someone to agree. Poor spirits, Miss Marple. The whole village knew it. Hadn't been himself since September. "No," Miss Marple said. A pause. No, I don't think so." She did not move toward the body. She moved, instead, toward the decanter, walking carefully, her sensible shoes making no sound on the Persian rug. She bent slightly at the waist, hands clasped behind her back, and looked at the stopper, then at the tray beneath it, then at the small ring of residue on the silver tray where the decanter had sat and been lifted and replaced, slightly off its original mark. Moved, and then moved back, but not quite back to the right place. "Has anyone touched this?" she asked. "No, ma'am," and the household was told to leave everything as found. And who found him? Mrs. Pringle, the housekeeper. She came in at 7:30 to open the curtains, as she does every morning. Miss Marple straightened and turned. Mrs. Pringle stood in the corridor just beyond the doorway, a tall woman, rigid-spined, with a face that had long since settled into an expression of permanent endurance. She had not been asked to come inside. She had come inside anyway, stopping precisely at the threshold, her hands folded at her waist in a posture that would have suited a church elder. "Mrs. Pringle," Miss Marple said, "how terrible for you, finding him like that." "Yes, ma'am." The voice was flat, not cold, flat. The difference mattered. "You came in at your usual time? 7:30. It's the same as always." "And the curtains were drawn?" "Both windows, yes." Miss Marple looked at the curtains, pewter grey wool, lined, thick enough to shut out the October dark entirely. Then at the gap between them. Then at the small square of pale morning light that fell across the corner of the desk nearest the door. She said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Pringle," she said at last mildly, "the curtains are half drawn now. You drew them when you found him." The housekeeper's eyes moved to the window. A fractional hesitation, the kind that would mean nothing to Constable Tibbs and everything to Miss Marple. Partly, yes, I went to the window first, out of habit. Of course, one does. Miss Marple smiled. Thank you. She turned back to the room. The smell was stronger near the desk. Wood smoke, boot polish, and under both of them that sharp, insistent note. Like vinegar, but not vinegar. Closer to something left too long in a medicine cabinet. The sherry glass beside the Colonel's hand had perhaps a finger's worth left in it. The sherry in the glass was the colour of dark amber. The sherry in the decanter she could see when she looked carefully was a very slightly different shade, lighter, as though something had been introduced into the decanter and not fully dissolved, and the Colonel had poured from near the bottom where it concentrated. She would not touch the glass. She would not need to. Constable Tibbs, she said, turning, I think you ought to ring Inspector Haverstock in Dorchester. Tibbs blinked. He was a young man, not unintelligent, but unformed, of the way young constables in villages often were before enough of life had happened to them. You think it's something more than, I think it would be wise to have someone look at that glass before anything is moved. She smiled again, the vague apologetic smile she had perfected over decades. The one that made people feel they were doing her a favour. I may be entirely wrong, of course. My niece says I see complications in everything. She's probably right. Still, Tibbs looked at the decanter, then at the Colonel, then back at Miss Marple. I'll ring him, he said.
Young Constable Tibbs was so very quick to declare it his own doing, a suicide. Any woman who has kept a house in the 1930s knows exactly how silver behaves. Someone moved that decanter in the dark and put it back poorly. She claimed she went to draw the curtains, but that sliver of light on the desk proved she acted after the discovery. Details, you see, they always betray the lie. The true venom was hidden in plain sight. It takes decades of living, my friends, to truly understand how people behave when they are frightened. And so, Inspector Haverstock had to be summoned. But a house without a master does not stay empty for long.
She found her niece, Mrs. Peel, waiting in the entrance hall with 2 other members of the household. A young man sitting very straight in a chair by the door, and a woman standing near the foot of the stairs with her arms crossed and her face composed into something that would have passed for grief if one didn't look too carefully at her eyes. Geoffrey Ashford was 34, dark-haired, wearing a suit that had been expensive some years ago and not replaced since. He was looking at his hands. His hands, Miss Marple observed, were trembling, but not with the loose, involuntary tremor of shock. They were held still, deliberately, the way a man holds something still when he is managing what it is doing, not surrendering to it. Sylvia Ashford was 38 and very beautiful, the kind of beauty maintained at some cost, a careful architecture of hair and posture, and the exact right expression worn at the exact right moment. She had been crying, and the evidence was there in the slight redness at the outer corners of her eyes, the careful way she held her chin. But her breathing was even. Her hands were still. She was, Miss Marple thought, managing something too. There was a third figure, smaller, set slightly apart near the corridor to the kitchen, holding a pair of knitting needles and a ball of grey wool she had clearly picked up and then forgotten about. Miss Edith Fowler. The companion. She was perhaps 44, brown-haired, wearing a cardigan the colour of old bracken. She was looking at Sylvia Ashford with an expression that was, in its intensity, entirely out of proportion with the careful blankness of her face. She looked away the moment she noticed Miss Marple watching. Miss Marple tucked the observation away, small, neat, precise, like a stitch counted and set. "Miss Marple," her niece said, coming forward with the relief of someone handing over a burden they had not known how to carry. "This is Sylvia Ashford, and Geoffrey, the Colonel's son. I've told them that I am a nosy old woman who takes an interest," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Yes, I'm so very sorry for your loss." Sylvia Ashford met her eyes. Hers were grey, clear, measuring, intelligent. "Thank you," she said. "The constable says it was his heart." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "The constable is very thorough." She looked once more at Geoffrey's hands. She looked once more at Miss Fowler, who had gone back to watching Sylvia, and had not, in the entire time Miss Marple had been standing in the hall, asked a single question about how the Colonel had died. Outside, the October rain had begun again. It struck the entrance hall windows in long grey sheets, and the smell of it came in under the door, cold and green and clean. Miss Marple was grateful for it. It cleared briefly the other smell, the one from the study, the one beneath the sherry, the one she was already quite certain about. She thought of Mr. Beckwith in St. Mary Mead, of his reading glasses folded on the wrong side, of how long it had taken anyone to ask the obvious question. She accepted a cup of tea from Miss Fowler, who brought it without being asked, who knew exactly where the cups were kept and how Miss Marple took it, though they had never met before this morning, and sat down to wait for Inspector Haverstock. Her own knitting was in her bag. She did not take it out yet. She was still thinking about the stopper. Part 2. The sun-rain had been falling since dawn. By 11 o'clock, it had settled into the particular rhythm of an English October. Not dramatic, not violent, simply permanent. The kind of rain that made indoor fires necessary and outdoor errands feel like moral failures. The copper kettle on High Street had steamed its windows entirely. Inside, Mrs. Hartwell, behind the counter, had already heard 3 versions of what had happened at Ashford Hall, each one worse than the last. The first version came from the butcher's boy, who had it from the station master's wife, who had spoken, briefly, urgently, in the doorway of the post office, with Constable Tibbs's mother. By this account, the Colonel had been found face down in his study, with an empty decanter and a note confessing to some unnamed financial disgrace. The second version, brought by Mrs. Price Ridley's cook 40 minutes later, had done away with the note entirely, and introduced a locked door and a missing revolver. The third version, which arrived with the vicar's wife just before 11, was considerably calmer and considerably closer to the truth. The Colonel had died, the manner was uncertain, and Inspector Haverstock had been sent for from Dorchester. Miss Marple sat at the corner table nearest the window, and listened to all 3 versions without appearing to listen at all. She had her tea. She had a scone she was not eating. She had a clear sight line to the door and to the table where Geoffrey Ashford had installed himself 20 minutes ago, with a pot of coffee he kept refilling and a cigarette he kept forgetting to smoke. He had not gone home after speaking to the constable, and that was the first thing. He had walked directly from Ashford Hall to the High Street. She had seen him from the lane, hands in his coat pockets, head down, and he had come here, to a public tea-room, rather than back to the hall where his stepmother was. That was a choice. Choices, Miss Marple had always found, told you rather more than words." She watched him now over the rim of her cup. Geoffrey Ashford had his father's jaw. Strong, slightly too heavy, but not his father's bearing. The Colonel had been a man who took up space with confidence. Geoffrey contracted. He sat with his shoulders drawn in, his elbows close to his body, as though he had spent years making himself smaller in rooms where he was not wanted. The suit was good quality, had been once. The cuffs were beginning to turn. He was looking at the table. He had been looking at the table since he sat down. Twice he reached into his breast pocket and touched something there, a letter from the outline, and withdrew his hand without taking it out. The third time he did this, Miss Marple set down her cup. She crossed the tea-room at the unhurried pace of a woman with nowhere particular to be and nothing particular on her mind. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "I'm Jane Marple. I'm staying with my niece at Peel Cottage, just behind the lane. We met briefly this morning. May I sit? I find I can't manage a whole scone alone, and the table by the window is rather draughty." He looked up. His eyes were reddish, but dry. She revised her estimate of him slightly upward. He had been crying before he came here, not after. The grief, whatever its nature, was something he had already worked through privately before presenting himself to the world, or the relief. She kept that thought set to one side, like a stitch on a spare needle. "Please," he said. She sat. She broke off a small piece of scone and buttered it with great attention, as though the task required concentration. "You came back from London, I understand. A long journey in poor weather." "I came back 3 days ago." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The trembling was less visible now. He had it under better control. "I hadn't been back in some time." "No." She did not ask why. She had learned over many decades that the space left by an unasked question was often more productive than the question itself. Geoffrey looked out at the rain. "He rang me, my father, 2 weeks ago. He rang me himself, which he hadn't done in 4 years, and said he thought I ought to come." A pause. "He didn't say why." "And did you ask?" "Yes." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. "He said there were things to be put in order. He said it in that voice he used for things that weren't going to be discussed further." "I see." Miss Marple ate her piece of scone. "Was he a man who put things in order often?" "Never. He was a man who left things exactly as they were, and expected everyone else to manage around them." Geoffrey's hands tightened around the cup. "I don't mean I'm not. He wasn't a cruel man. He was simply certain about everything, always certain." Outside, a gust pushed rain hard against the window, and the flame in the oil lamp on their table shivered. "Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple said, with the mildness of a woman discussing something of very little consequence, "when you saw your father last, was he in good health? His spirits?" A pause. Something moved across Geoffrey's face. Fast, then controlled. "The constable thinks that it was his choice, his own hand." "Yes? What do you think?" The pause this time was longer. She watched him decide, watched the calculation move through him, the weighing of what to say against what he actually knew. "I think," he said carefully, "that my father was not a man who would make that choice. He was, even at his lowest, and I knew his lowest, he was constitutionally opposed to giving up on anything." His jaw set. "I think it looks very convenient for several people that it should appear otherwise." Several people, Miss Marple repeated, thoughtfully. He changed the will. Geoffrey said it without looking at her, looking instead at the window, at the pewter sheet of rain beyond it, his voice flat and deliberate. I don't know the particulars. I know he changed it because Mrs. Pringle, the housekeeper, let something slip 2 days ago that she clearly hadn't meant to. Something about the solicitor's visit in September. He touched the letter in his pocket again, drew his hand back. I imagine I am not the beneficiary I once was. And that troubles you? Of course it troubles me. He met her eyes for the first time since she'd sat down. His were brown, dark, tired, honest in the way that exhausted people sometimes were when they had stopped managing their expressions. I won't pretend otherwise to be polite. I need money. I came back because he asked me to. But I also came back because I need money. And he knew I needed money. And I thought perhaps that was part of why he'd called. A long breath. I was wrong about that too, it appears. Miss Marple said nothing. She poured more tea, for herself, and then without asking for him, though he had coffee. He didn't correct her. She thought of a young man she had known in St. Mary Mead. Not Geoffrey's type at all, but the same quality of honesty in the wrong direction. The kind of honesty that told you the truth about one thing to keep you looking away from another. She filed that away too. The companion, she said, Miss Fowler. Has she been with the household long? Geoffrey blinked at the change of subject. 3 years, I think, perhaps 4. And she came when my stepmother said she needed someone. A slight tightening around the word stepmother, not hostility, she thought. Something more complicated. She's very devoted to Sylvia. Rather too devoted, if I'm being honest, though one doesn't say so. No, Miss Marple agreed, one doesn't.
A house in mourning is a stage, my dears, and everyone must play their part. But life teaches us to distinguish our tremors. It was not the loose shaking of a man in shock, but the rigid trembling of a man fighting to keep control. Then there was Sylvia, the widow. Flawless hair, perfect posture, dabbing her eyes at precisely the right. And lingering in the shadows was the companion, Miss Fowler. Plain, quiet, and easily ignored. He believed his father had recently changed his will. Money, my dears, is a terrible poison in a family. Geoffrey kept touching his breast pocket, where a letter lay hidden. Experience teaches you that when a man repeatedly touches a hidden thing, the pieces were beginning to align. The altered will, the estranged son, the devoted companion, and that sharp medicinal sting. But to understand a house, one must understand its foundation. And there is no foundation firmer or colder.
She looked out at the rain. She was thinking about the decanter, the stopper tilted 3 degrees. She was thinking about the way the chemical smell had concentrated near the bottom of the glass. She was thinking about Miss Edith Fowler, standing in the entrance hall with a ball of grey wool she had entirely forgotten she was holding, watching Sylvia Ashford with an expression that had nothing of grief in it and nothing of fear. What it had, Miss Marple thought, it was the particular fixed quality of someone who had made a decision some time ago and was no longer afraid of it. She gathered her bag and her scone, which she had largely not eaten. "Thank you, Mr. Ashford," she said, rising. "You've been very kind to an old woman. I do hope things become clearer soon." He nodded. His hands, she noticed as she left, had settled completely still around the untouched cup of tea she had poured him. She walked back out into the rain. Part 3. The Housekeeper. Mrs. Pringle made tea the way she did everything, with complete authority and no warmth whatsoever. She filled the kettle, set it on the range, arranged the cups on the tray in order of size, and did not once look at Miss Marple, who sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her eyes moving slowly around the room. And the kitchen at Ashford Hall smelled of rendered fat and yesterday's bread, and, very faintly, of the bleach Mrs. Pringle had used on the stone floor that morning. Underneath all of it, persistent, catching, that sharp note again. Closer here than it had been in the study, as though it had travelled or been carried. Miss Marple said nothing about the smell. She said instead, "You've been at Ashford Hall a long time, Mrs. Pringle. 11 years, the kettle, the pot, the precise measurement of leaves. The Colonel was a good employer." A pause, not hesitation, but the pause of someone selecting which truth to offer. "He was a fair man, knew what he wanted, and said so plainly. I've worked for worse. And Mrs. Ashford, she came, when was it? 7 years ago? 6. The correction was immediate, precise. They married in October of 46. Of course. Miss Marple accepted the cup placed before her with a small murmur of thanks. You knew her before, I think, before she came here. The stillness that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In a different woman, it might have gone unnoticed. In Mrs. Pringle, whose every movement was controlled and deliberate, 2 seconds of stillness was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. She sat down across the table, folded her hands, met Miss Marple's eyes with the directness of someone who had decided that looking away would cost more than looking straight ahead. "I worked for her family," she said, "the Cavendishes, 8 years in Wiltshire. I left before she married the Colonel." "I see. And you came here, to Ashford Hall, afterward?" 2 years afterward. The Colonel advertised. I applied. I didn't know at first that Mrs. Ashford was the same. She stopped, rearranged something in her expression. I knew when I arrived. I stayed because the position suited me. Miss Marple stirred her tea. "It must have been a little awkward. At first. It was. Flat final." The voice of a woman who had long since stopped allowing awkwardness to inconvenience her. Outside the kitchen window, the October garden was being systematically destroyed by the rain. The rose bushes along the back wall had gone mostly brown, their last few petals beaten down into the mud. A pewter-coloured thrush sat on the garden wall for a moment, then thought better of it and left. Miss Marple watched the garden. "Mrs. Pringle, you left the Cavendish household. Was that your choice?" The hands on the table tightened, just slightly, and the knuckles whitened at 2 joints and then, deliberately, relaxed. "I was asked to leave." "I see. It was a misunderstanding." The word came out very precisely, as though it had been carried a long distance. "About some household accounts. It was resolved, eventually. But the damage was done, and Mrs. Cavendish, Sylvia's mother, was not a woman who forgave easily once she'd decided something." "No," Miss Marple said. "Some women aren't." She looked at her tea. She was thinking about the word resolved, and what it might mean in the mouth of a woman like Mrs. Pringle, and what it might mean in the records of the Cavendish household accounts, and whether those 2 meanings were the same thing. "Did you hold that against Mrs. Ashford?" she asked. "The dismissal, I mean. Her mother's decision." Mrs. Pringle's chin came up a degree. "Miss Sylvia Cavendish was 17 when I left. She had nothing to do with it. No, but one sometimes carries these things regardless." A long silence, the rain against the window, the range ticking as it cooled. "I didn't kill him," Mrs. Pringle said. She said it without drama, not defensive, not angry, simply stating a fact she considered relevant to the conversation. if that's what you're working toward." "I'm not working toward anything," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I'm an old woman drinking tea in a kitchen. Inspector Haverstock will be here by 2 o'clock, and he'll ask the proper questions in the proper order. I'm simply curious. It's a failing of mine." Mrs. Pringle looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the rigid face, not softening exactly, but a fractional recalibration, and the way a person looks when they have reassessed the weight of what they are dealing with. "I didn't like him," she said, "the Colonel. He was fair, as I said, but fair isn't the same as kind. He was not a kind man. He was hard on Geoffrey. Drove the boy off, really, whatever anyone says, and he was—" She stopped. "Hard on his wife?" Miss Marple offered mildly. "Not in any way I could have reported." Each word placed with care. "He simply diminished people, without raising his voice, without doing anything one could point to. He made you feel, after an hour in his company, that you were considerably less than you'd believed yourself to be." Miss Marple thought of several people in St. Mary Mead who had possessed this same quality. It was, she had always felt, the most dangerous kind of cruelty, the kind that left no marks. "Miss Fowler," she said, "the companion, what do you make of her?" Mrs. Pringle's expression did something complicated and brief. "She's devoted to Mrs. Ashford." "Yes, I noticed that." "Devoted," Mrs. Pringle repeated, with a slight dry emphasis that gave the word a different weight entirely, "is perhaps an understatement." Miss Marple set down her cup. She looked at the window, at the ruined garden, at the pewter sky pressing down on the rose bushes. She thought about the study, the stopper, the smell, the decanter moved and replaced. She thought about the 3 weeks it would take, administered carefully, in small measures, in something that masked the taste. Sherry, for instance. A strong, sweet sherry, taken every evening before dinner by a man of fixed habits. She thought about who poured that sherry. Not Mrs. Pringle. The housekeeper's domain ended at the kitchen. Not Geoffrey, who had only been back 3 days. Not Sylvia, who had her own reasons to want distance from her husband, and would have been foolish beyond measure to provide the means of his death with her own hands. Someone quiet, someone present, someone who moved through the rooms of Ashford Hall like furniture, noticed only when needed and otherwise invisible. Someone who knew where the decanter was kept, and the cups, and the Colonel's habits, and the exact depth of Sylvia Ashford's unhappiness. "Mrs. Pringle," she said, standing slowly, gathering her bag, "one last thing. The morning you found him, you came directly to the study." "Yes. Not to the kitchen first? Or to call for Mrs. Ashford?" The briefest pause. "No. Directly to the study." "And how did you know to go there first? Was it usual? Was he often in the study at that hour?" Mrs. Pringle opened her mouth, closed it. "He was usually at breakfast by 7, she said. When he wasn't, yes, the study was where one looked." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Thank you, Mrs. Pringle. The tea was excellent." She walked out through the kitchen door into the corridor, where the smell of bleach faded, and the sharper note, chemical, persistent, did not. In her mind, very quietly, something clicked into place. Not the whole of it, not yet, but enough to know the shape of what she was looking for, and where, precisely, to look next. Part 4. The Companion. She was in the sitting room when Miss Marple found her, not doing anything precisely. He sitting in the chair nearest the fireplace with a piece of mending in her lap. One of Sylvia's blouses, pale blue silk, the kind of thing that required careful hands, and her needle moving in and out with the steady, automatic rhythm of someone whose hands had been trained to occupy themselves while the mind went elsewhere entirely. The fire had burned low. Miss Edith Fowler had not fed it. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, and something moved across her face. Not alarm, not welcome. A kind of rapid internal adjustment, the way a person looks when they have been very far away and must now return to the room they are sitting in. "Miss Marple?" Her voice was light. "Careful. Can I get you anything? There's tea. I think Mrs. Pringle left a pot." "I've just had some, thank you. May I sit?" "Of course." Miss Marple settled into the chair across the fireplace. The sitting room at Ashford Hall was more Sylvia's territory than the Colonel's. Softer furnishings, a bowl of dried lavender on the side table, watercolours on the walls rather than hunting prints. It smelled of that lavender and of cold ash, and beneath both, something that made Miss Marple's needle-sharp attention go very still. Almonds, not strong, not obvious. The ghost of it, clinging to the fabric of the chair, to the air near the fireplace, to the faint warmth coming off Edith Fowler's cardigan as she bent back over her mending. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. She did not reach for her knitting. "You've been with Mrs. Ashford 3 years," she said. "It must feel rather like home by now." 4 years. The correction was gentle, automatic. "Since the spring of 48. A small pause. "It does feel like home. Yes. And the Colonel, you got along with him, working in his household all that time?" The needle went in, came out, in out. "He was courteous to me." A fractional hesitation on the word courteous, as though she had selected it from a longer list and discarded the others. "He didn't take much notice of me generally. I was here for Sylvia. He understood that. Mrs. Ashford needed a companion. She was lonely. Edith said it simply, without apology. This house, the village, it's very isolated in winter, and the Colonel was not. He didn't have much conversation outside his own interests. She needed someone to talk to." Miss Marple looked at the blouse in Edith's lap. Blue silk, very fine. A small tear at the underarm seam being closed with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. The care in it was striking. Not the efficient care of a woman doing her job, but something more concentrated, more personal. "You're very fond of her," Miss Marple said. The needle stilled for just one stitch, then continued. "She's been very kind to me. I was in a difficult position when she found me, a previous situation that had ended badly. She took me on without. She was generous." "I see." Miss Marple let a moment pass. Then, "It must have been painful, watching her in an unhappy marriage." Edith looked up. Her eyes were brown, ordinary brown, the colour of last year's leaves. But there was something in them now that had not been there before. Not fear, something older and more settled than fear. All marriages have their difficulties. "Of course," Miss Marple smiled, "though some more than others." She let that sit between them. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist that blurred the sitting-room windows and made the garden beyond them look like something half-remembered. The fire crackled once, softly, and subsided. "Miss Fowler," Miss Marple said, in the same mild conversational tone she had used for everything else. "I've been sitting in this room for 10 minutes, and I notice you haven't asked me anything about the Colonel." The needle stopped. "Everyone else has asked," Miss Marple continued. "Geoffrey asked 3 times in the tea-room. Mrs. Pringle asked, obliquely, but she asked. Even Constable Tibbs's manner of not asking was its own kind of question." She paused. "You haven't asked how he died." You haven't asked whether the constable truly thinks it was his heart. You haven't asked what Inspector Haverstock will want to know, or whether there will be an inquest, or any of the dozen things a person in your position would naturally want to know. Edith Fowler was very still, the blouse in her lap, the cold fire, the smell of lavender and ash, and, faint as a rumour, almonds. I assumed, she said, that it would become clear in time. Yes, Miss Marple said, I imagine you did. She looked at the tin of biscuits on the side table. She had not noticed it when she sat down. Edith had clearly brought it from the kitchen at some point, set it out with the quiet, anticipatory thoughtfulness of someone accustomed to providing comfort. The lid was off. The biscuits inside were the plain shortbread sort, homemade from the look of them, and the tin itself smelled faintly of almonds, not marzipan, not baking, the particular sharp medicinal edge of something that had been near almonds for a long time, or something that produced a similar smell as a byproduct. Something introduced, perhaps, into a substance stored nearby. Something that, in a pewter-stoppered glass decanter of strong sweet sherry, would be very nearly undetectable to anyone not specifically looking. Miss Marple did not touch the tin. She thought of Mr. Beckwith in St. Mary Mead. His reading glasses folded on the wrong side. The way everyone had looked at his son, who had motive, who had temper, who had been seen arguing with the old man in the street, and looked away from the woman who brought his evening cocoa, and had done so, quietly and without comment, for 11 years. The invisible woman, the one nobody thought to watch. She had been too late for Mr. Beckwith. She did not intend to be too late here. Miss Fowler, she said, standing, smoothing her skirt with both hands. I wonder, could you tell me where the Colonel kept his personal correspondence? His recent letters, I mean. Inspector Haverstock will want to look through them, and it would save time if someone who knows the household could point him in the right direction. Edith stood too. The blouse slid from her lap and she caught it, folded it with automatic precision, and set it on the arm of the chair. His desk, she said, the left-hand drawer, the deep one. He kept everything there. She said it without thinking, without being told which drawer, without asking which desk. There were two in the house, one in the study, one in the Colonel's dressing room, and without a flicker of uncertainty about where the correspondence would be, in a desk that was not hers, in a room she had no professional reason to know well. Miss Marple smiled. Thank you. You've been very helpful. She walked to the door, stopped, as though remembering something of no particular importance. The biscuits, she said, homemade? Yes, a beat. I made them yesterday morning. How lovely. Miss Marple looked at the tin, at the open lid, at the faint, persistent smell that had followed her across the room. You must give Mrs. Peel the recipe sometime. She does love shortbread. She left before Edith could answer. In the corridor, she stopped, pressed one hand briefly against the wall. Not for balance. She was steadier on her feet than people assumed. For something else. The particular steadiness required when you have just looked at something you cannot unsee and must now decide, carefully and without haste, what to do about it. She was not triumphant. She was not satisfied. She was, if anything, profoundly sorry. Part 5. The Will Inspector Haverstock arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, which Miss Marple considered a good sign. He was a tall man, angular in the way of someone who had been thinner in youth and never quite adjusted to the additional weight of middle age, with a grey moustache kept rather less neatly than the Colonel's had been, and a manner that suggested competence without inspiration. He had brought a sergeant and a doctor, which was also a good sign. He had not brought assumptions, which was the best sign of all. Miss Marple met him in the entrance hall. Introduced herself with the apologetic vagueness she reserved for first meetings with policemen, and was gratified to observe that he did not dismiss her. He was the sort of man, she decided, who had been surprised by an elderly woman before, and had learned something from it. "The decanter," she said when he had heard the constable's account, "and the glass, before anything else is moved." He looked at her steadily. "You think poison. I think the glass should be tested before we decide what we think." He sent the doctor to the study immediately. They sat in the morning room, Miss Marple, Inspector Haverstock, and a pot of tea that Mrs. Pringle produced with the efficiency of a woman who understood that policemen required tea in the same way that engines required fuel, and the morning room smelled of old paper and chrysanthemums. Someone had put a vase of them on the windowsill, yellow and sharp-scented, aggressively cheerful against the grey afternoon. "The will," Miss Marple said. "I understand it was recently changed." Haverstock looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Where did you hear that?" "Geoffrey Ashford mentioned it, obliquely." She poured the tea, for both of them, without asking. "He doesn't know the particulars, only that a solicitor visited in September, and that something changed. The solicitor was a Mr. Aldrich, from Dorchester." Haverstock accepted his cup. "I rang him before I drove up. He was reluctant, but the Colonel is dead, and the circumstances are uncertain, so he was forthcoming enough." A pause. "The Colonel changed his will on the 14th of September, and completely. The previous will divided the estate between Geoffrey and a small legacy for Mrs. Ashford. The new will cuts Geoffrey out entirely. Mrs. Ashford receives the house in trust for her lifetime. Everything else, the investments, the capital, the remainder of the estate, goes to a charitable trust, children's hospitals." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Children's hospitals. The Colonel apparently had a nephew who died young. It was that sort of decision." "I see." She looked at the chrysanthemums. "And who knew about this change?" "According to Aldrich, 2 people, the Colonel himself, and whoever he chose to tell." Haverstock's eyes were on her steadily. "He told no one, as far as Aldrich knew. It was to be announced at a family gathering the Colonel had planned for the end of October." 2 people, Miss Marple thought, in the Colonel and Mr. Aldrich. And yet, she thought of Edith Fowler, knowing without hesitation which drawer held the Colonel's correspondence. She thought of the solicitor's letter, the kind of letter a man kept, the kind a careful, thorough man filed in the deep left-hand drawer of his desk, the kind a person might find if they moved through the rooms of a house like furniture, present and unnoticed, with 4 years of accumulated knowledge of every habit and hiding place. "Inspector," she said, "I think you'll find that at least one other person in this household knew about the will. Not from the Colonel directly, from his correspondence." Haverstock was quiet for a moment. "Miss Fowler." She looked at him with mild surprise, genuine this time. "She's the only one who moves freely through all the rooms," he said. I noticed it when I arrived. The others have territories, Mrs. Pringle in the kitchen and service rooms, Mrs. Ashford in the sitting room and her bedroom, the son nowhere comfortable at all. Miss Fowler was in 3 different rooms in the time it took me to hang up my coat. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "exactly." She told him then about the biscuit tin, about the smell, about the drawer, named without hesitation, about the question that had never been asked. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Some inspectors interrupted. It was, she had always felt, their most significant professional failing. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Rain tapped at the morning room windows. The chrysanthemums nodded slightly in the draught from the door. "It's behavioural," he said, "all of it. Nothing I could take to a magistrate yet. No, but the glass will tell you something. And I think if you look carefully at the Colonel's desk, the left-hand drawer, the deep one, you'll find the solicitor's letter has been read recently. Not by the Colonel. The Colonel was left-handed. He kept the drawer handle worn on the left side where he pulled it. If the letter shows handling from the right." Haverstock stood up. He was already moving toward the door. "Miss Marple," he said, pausing, "how long have you known?" She considered this honestly. "I knew the shape of it when I looked at the decanter this morning. I knew who when I sat with her an hour ago." She looked at her tea. "Knowing and understanding are different things, Inspector. I know what she did. I'm still working on why." He left. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, or direct and purposeful. She stayed where she was. She was thinking about St. Mary Mead, about Mr. Beckwith, and the reading glasses, and the woman who had brought his cocoa for 11 years. That woman had been motivated by money, a legacy promised and then withdrawn. Simple, clean, the kind of motive that made a terrible sense. This was not that. Edith Fowler had no legacy coming. The new will confirmed it.
It is always a relief when a sensible man arrives. Inspector Haverstock came from Dorchester without assumptions. We sat in the morning room, surrounded by the sharp scent of yellow chrysanthemums. The inspector had spoken to the Colonel's solicitor. A man's last will and testament is a fascinating document. Colonel Ashford had changed his will. He cut out his son, Geoffrey, entirely. A noble gesture to the world, perhaps. Only the Colonel and the solicitor knew of this change. The Colonel was left-handed. The drawer was worn on the left. But the solicitor's letter inside had been disturbed from the right side. There is a particular kind of love that decides, all on its own, what another person needs. It acts without asking.
There was nothing for companions, nothing for household staff, beyond a modest sum to Mrs. Pringle. Edith Fowler had poisoned a man and gained, materially, nothing. Which meant the will itself was not the point. The will was, if anything, a coincidence. A discovery that had perhaps accelerated a decision already forming. A confirmation that the Colonel's death would leave Sylvia with the house, with security, or with the quiet life she deserved, and had been denied. Not for money, for her. Miss Marple thought about that kind of love, the sort that decided, alone and in silence, what another person needed, the sort that acted without asking, the sort that was so certain of its own rightness that it required no permission and sought no acknowledgement. She had known one or two such people in St. Mary Mead. They were, without exception, the most dangerous people she had ever encountered. Not because they were cruel, because they were certain. Cruelty could be reasoned with, sometimes negotiated with. Certainty of this particular kind, the certainty of someone who loved completely and had decided that love entitled them to act, admitted no argument and recognized no limit. The fire in the morning room had been properly fed, she noticed, as someone had added coal while she sat here thinking. She had not heard anyone come in. Part 6. The Thread. The doctor's report came at 3:30. Haverstock read it in the corridor outside the morning room, then folded it twice and came back inside without changing his expression, which told Miss Marple, more clearly than any expression would have, that the report confirmed what neither of them had wanted confirmed. "Arsenic," he said. In the glass. Concentrated at the bottom, as you said. The doctor estimates it had been introduced into the decanter over an extended period, weeks, not days. The colonel's constitution was strong. It took 3 weeks to kill him. 3 weeks. Miss Marple thought about that, about the patience it required, about waking each morning for 21 days and going about the ordinary business of a household, pouring tea, mending silk blouses, finding the right biscuit tin, while carrying that knowledge. That decision. She did not find it monstrous. She found it, which was perhaps worse, entirely comprehensible. The letter, she said, in the drawer, read recently, the paper disturbed, as you suggested, from the right side. The colonel's letter opener is on the left of the blotter. It was used from the right. He sat down, looked at his hands briefly. She knew about the will. Yes, a pause. Did it change anything, do you think? Knowing, he considered, it might have confirmed something, that the colonel was arranging things in a way that left Sylvia provided for. Perhaps she felt... He stopped. Oh, that it was almost done for her, Miss Marple said quietly. That the colonel himself was, in some sense, tidying his own affairs, and she simply completed the tidying. The word hung between them, terrible in its domesticity. Outside the window, the mist had thickened into something approaching fog. The garden had disappeared entirely. The afternoon was the colour of old pewter. No, she checked herself. She had used that word enough. The afternoon was the colour of nothing, flat and without feature, the way the end of things sometimes looked. She took out her knitting. She had not taken it out before now. She had carried it in her bag all day, through the study, through the kitchen, through the sitting room with its smell of almonds and cold ash, and had not once reached for it. Or now she needed something for her hands to do that was not thinking, so that she could think properly. The needles clicked. Once, twice, found their rhythm. She is not a wicked woman, Miss Marple said. Haverstock looked at her. I want to be clear about that. Before whatever happens next, I want to say it plainly. She is not wicked. She has a particular kind of love, the sort that convinces itself it knows best, and she acted from that love as absolutely as if she had been given permission. The needles clicked on. That does not make it less of a murder. It makes it, in some ways, more of a tragedy, because she will not understand, even now, I think, that she was wrong. She'll understand when the jury tells her. Will she? Miss Marple looked at him over her knitting. I wonder, as people of her particular certainty tend to experience the law as a misunderstanding rather than a verdict, she will think the world has failed to grasp something obvious. A pause. She may be right that she loved Sylvia. She is entirely wrong about everything else. Haverstock was quiet. The fire had been fed again. She heard it settle, a soft collapse of coal, and the morning room was warm now in the particular heavy way of rooms sealed against October. Mrs. Ashford, he said, does she know? No. Miss Marple was certain of this. Sylvia Ashford is a composed woman, but she is not composed about this. When I looked at her this morning, there was genuine confusion in her grief, not guilt, not the specific guilt of someone who knew what was being done in their name. She thought of those grey, immeasuring eyes in the entrance hall. She will be devastated, in more directions than one. I'll need to speak with her before I speak with Miss Fowler. Yes, be careful how you do it. She said it without apology, as a practical instruction. She will feel responsible. She is not responsible, but she will feel it. That feeling, if it hardens into something permanent, will damage her more than the marriage did. He nodded. He was, she decided, a good man. Not brilliant. Brilliance was rarer than people supposed, but careful and decent and willing to be told things by people who knew more than he did without letting it wound his dignity. That was rarer still. The decanter, she said, it was moved, replaced slightly wrong. That bothered me from the beginning, because it suggested someone had removed it. It introduced the arsenic into it elsewhere and returned it, not poured something into it in place. Her needles slowed. That means a degree of premeditation that goes beyond impulse. She made a decision, prepared the means, introduced them over 3 weeks. This was not a moment of desperate action. This was a plan carried out with patience and care. Like her mending, Haverstock said, quietly. Miss Marple looked at him with something close to surprise. "The stitches," he said with a slight awkwardness. "My wife sews. She'd have noticed too, I think. The blouse. Stitches that small take. Concentration. Commitment." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Exactly that. Commitment." She looked at her knitting. She was making gloves. Grey wool, simple pattern. She had been making them for her nephew's youngest, who had cold hands and never remembered his own. She looked at the stitches and thought about commitment and patience, and the long, quiet weeks of doing something irreversible, one small measure at a time. She thought about Edith Fowler, alone in the sitting room with the fire gone cold and Sylvia's blouse in her lap. Waiting, not with fear, with the absolute stillness of someone who has done what they believed needed doing and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up. "She'll confess," Miss Marple said, "when you speak to her. She won't resist, not because she is weak, but because she won't see the point. She will want it understood correctly. She will want to explain." A pause. Let her explain. Don't interrupt her. Whatever she says, let her say it fully. Haverstock stood, straightened his jacket. Any other instructions? The dryness in his voice was, she felt, entirely earned. "No," she said, "only be kind to all of them. It has been a very unkind house." He left. The fire settled again. The fog pressed at the windows. Miss Marple's needles clicked on in the empty room, steady and quiet, counting out the stitches of something that was not yet finished, but was beginning, at last, to take its proper shape. Part 7. The Reckoning. She confessed at 4 o'clock. Miss Marple was not in the room when it happened. She was in the entrance hall, sitting on the straight-back chair near the door where Geoffrey Ashford had sat that morning. It felt like a week ago, that morning, with her knitting in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and her ears registering, without effort, at the quality of the silence coming from the sitting room down the corridor. There was a long silence. Then Haverstock's voice, low, asking something. Then nothing for quite some time. Then Edith Fowler's voice, not loud, not broken, but continuous, uninterrupted, explaining. Miss Marple had told him not to interrupt her. He hadn't. She sat and knitted and listened to the sound of a woman telling the truth about something that would end her life as she had known it, and felt none of the satisfaction she might once, in some younger and less weathered version of herself, have expected to feel. What she felt was tired. Sylvia Ashford had been told first, by Haverstock carefully, in the morning room with the chrysanthemums. Miss Marple had heard her cry. Not the composed, managed grief of the entrance hall that morning, but something rawer and more honest. The sound of a woman learning that she had been loved in a way she had never asked for and could not now undo. She had not come out of the morning room since. Mrs. Pringle had taken her tea. Not because she was asked, because she knew, in the rigid, unflinching way she knew everything about this household, that tea was what the situation required. She set it outside the door and went back to her kitchen without a word. Geoffrey had been in the library when Haverstock spoke to him. He had listened, asked 2 questions, both practical, both about legal process, and then sat down very heavily in the chair by the window and looked out at the fog. He was still there. His hands, Miss Marple noted when she passed the open door, were finely still. They brought Edith Fowler out at 4:20, and she was wearing her coat already, the brown wool one, with the pewter-coloured buttons Miss Marple had noticed that morning. She had put it on herself before they asked. She carried nothing else. She walked past Miss Marple in the entrance hall without stopping. Then she did stop, turned. Her face was entirely calm, not the performed calm of Sylvia's composure, or the rigid calm of Mrs. Pringle's endurance. Something else. The stillness of a person who has said everything they had to say and has nothing left to manage. "She never knew," Edith said. "I want that understood. Sylvia never knew anything about it." "I know," Miss Marple said. "She would have stopped me." A pause. "She wouldn't have understood." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She wouldn't have." Edith looked at her for a moment, steadily, without appeal. Not asking for absolution, not asking for understanding, simply making sure the record was correct, the way a careful woman checks a seam before she cuts. "He made her very small," Edith said. "Every year, a little smaller. She doesn't see it yet. How much smaller she had become. She will, eventually. She'll have room to see it now." Miss Marple said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be both honest and kind, and she had long since stopped saying things that were only one of the two. Haverstock's sergeant opened the front door. Cold air came in off the October dark, wet leaves and wood smoke, and the particular clean emptiness of a village after rain. Edith Fowler walked out into it without looking back. Miss Marple remained in the entrance hall for a little while after the police car had gone. The house was very quiet. Houses after arrests always were. A specific quality of quiet, different from ordinary evening silence. Heavier, more aware of itself. She put her knitting away. She thought about what Edith had said. She will have room to see it now. The absolute conviction of it, the certainty that what had been done was not only necessary but correct. That Sylvia's grief, Sylvia's horror, Sylvia's devastation at learning what had been carried out in the shadow of her own life, all of it was simply the necessary cost of a freedom Edith had decided to purchase on her behalf. That was the part that stayed with Miss Marple. Not the arsenic, not the 3 weeks of patience, not even the love, which had been real enough in its way. The certainty, the absolute and unassailable certainty of someone who had loved another person so completely that they had ceased to leave room for that person to be anything other than what they needed them to be. She had known one such person in St. Mary Mead, a woman who had managed her sister's entire life, her friendships, her finances, her very opinions, out of love so consuming it had left the sister nothing of her own. The sister had not known whether to mourn or rejoice when the woman died. She had done both, in the end, on alternate days, for a very long time. Miss Marple had understood that completely. She let herself out through the front door and walked back down the lane toward Peel Cottage in the dark. The fog had thinned. The village was lit in the way of October evenings, warm windows, chimney smoke, at the particular amber of a world closing in against the cold. From somewhere across the green came the smell of someone's dinner, something with onions and rosemary, deeply ordinary, deeply reassuring. She walked slowly. She was not in a hurry. Behind her, in the Colonel's study, the decanter sat on its tray in the dark, stopper slightly askew, catching nothing, reflecting nothing. The last of the October light was long gone. Tomorrow someone would move it. Eventually, someone would throw it away, or pack it in newspaper for an estate sale, and it would end up in someone else's house on someone else's tray, holding nothing more dangerous than sherry. She thought about that, about how objects outlasted everything, the intentions behind them, the hands that had touched them, the careful, terrible purposes they had briefly served. She turned up her collar against the cold and walked on. The village closed around her. The knitting was in her bag. She would finish the gloves tomorrow, she thought, or the day after. She was in no hurry. Her nephew's youngest would get them when they were ready, and not before. Some things, she had always believed, could not be rushed. Other things, she thought, walking through the dark and the clean smell of rain-wet leaves. Other things should never have been started at all.
The truth finally arrived at 4 o'clock. A confession. And young Geoffrey sat by the window, his hands finally still. The awful waiting was over. She possessed the terrifying stillness of someone who believes they have done the absolute right thing. She told me the Colonel made his wife smaller every year. It is a vital lesson to remember. Cruelty does not always shout. But certainty is a dangerous poison. When they were gone, the house changed. It's reassuring how ordinary life simply insists on continuing, no matter the tragedy next door. As for me, I have a pair of grey wool gloves to finish knitting. I shall not rush them.